I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Muna Ndulo.
Yeah, that's correct.
He's Professor of Law, Elizabeth and Arthur Reich Director, Leo and Arvila Berger International Legal Studies Program of Cornell Law School, and Director of the Cornell University's Institute of African Development. He's also Honorary Professor of Law, Faculty of Law, University of Cape Town, and Extraordinary Professor of Law, Free State University. He was formerly Professor of Law and Dean of School of Law at the University of Zambia. He served as legal officer in the International Trade Law branch of the United Nations Commission of International Trade Law from 1986 to 1995. He has carried out several UN assignments, including serving as political and legal advisor with the United Nations Observer Mission in South Africa, and the Special Representative of the United Nations Secretary General at South Africa from 1992 to 1994, Kosovo 2000, Afghanistan 2003, and East Timor in 1999. More recently, he has been a consultant to the constitution-making process in Kenya, Somalia, and Zimbabwe. He has published 14 books and over 100 articles in academic journals. He is the founder of Southern African Institute of Policy and Research. Professor Ndulo graduated in law at the University of Zambia with an LLB degree and subsequently earned the LLM at Harvard University and D.Phil at Oxford University. Professor, very welcome here. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. I also thank the foundation for inviting me here. I'm delighted to be here. It's the first time that I have visited Colombia and its beautiful city, Bogota. So thank you very much for all that have made it possible for me to be here. Now, my focus of discussion, I think I sent a paper to you which is entitled Transitional Justice, Responses to Human Rights Violations and International Initiative. So what I want to try and do is to draw on my experiences in terms of what the issues are in sort of post-conflict societies, what kind of challenges one faces. And I think here what I'm going to try and focus is, first, of course, the approaches that one sees in the world, and what are some of the problems associated with those approaches. And I'm sure that many of you have come across these approaches. We have the truth commissions, the amnesty approaches, the prosecution, and what are some of the issues that come up. And I also look at judicial reform and the rule of law, because in the UN processes that I have worked in, we have focused on these issues in terms of reconstructing the society, a post-conflict society, in terms of trying to heal the past and then move forward. Now, I think it's important to, at the outset, to say that, trying to deal with the past human rights violations is a daunting task. Here I would like to start by quoting Albie Sachs in terms of what he observed in the context of South Africa. He says that, the real question is, how do you deal with the past without in any way equating the struggles of each side in the process of national building, so that you're not making a judgment or trying to equate what one side did against what the other did. And that, of course, is the recognition that if you try to do that, often then you begin to run into tremendous hurdles. And I think the other point he makes is that, reconciliation takes a long time. And in the context of South Africa, you observe that, for example, as for our generation, it would never be total, But at least the foundations can be made, that you can begin to make the foundation for the future. And I think that's usually also really, the critical point that should be made. And of course, as I pointed out, I did allude to the daunting nature of the challenge. Because in any conflict, all sides are likely to insist that the truth be publicized and be accepted by all parties, but each side has its own version of the truth. And that, of course, is the challenge. Now, I think first describing what one sees in terms of post-conflict societies, I think that post-conflict societies typically experience widespread human rights violations. And these rights typically include right to life that are violated, liberty, freedom of speech, movement, and all sorts of rights are actually implicated in the process. And one of the major challenges that one faces in every post-conflict society is how to deal with these past human rights violations. If you look at transitional justice literature, you find that it focuses on discussions is always about what do we do to perpetrators of past human rights violations. And of course, the challenge then, of course, is to come up with what sort of options do you have in terms of dealing with the past. Now, if you look at the UN has been involved in a number of transitional justice programs, and typically, in their case, they try to help societies come to terms with the legacy of large-scale human rights violations. Now, the focus is often, of course, reconciliation, and not only reconciliation, but also the transformation of the society, so that you deal with the issues that brought about the conflict. So it's also not simply dealing with the past, but also try to, how do you transform the society to a democratic society that is underpinned by human rights values? And I think that's often the big challenge. Now, in terms of options, I think what we see is that typically 3 or so options are presented. There's, of course, the prosecution, that you can prosecute individuals that perpetrated the violations. There are also processes that focus on truth. And this is I think for the term for this we use, of course, are what we now call the truth commissions, which insist on trying to establish what the truth is. Of course, in trying to do that, the goal is to make truth bring closure to what happened and also liberate people. There's also, of course, in a lot of the work that you see, work focused on institutional reforms. And I think here in institutional reforms, often what is targeted are the various institutions in society that can help transform the society into a society that is truly post-conflict. And I think that the goal in all this, of course, is, as I explained earlier on, is the question of bring about reconciliation and reconstruction of the society. Now, I think as we have seen, as we look at the options that are present, we must always remember that whatever process is adopted, it must be context-driven. And I think that's very, very important to remember. While the best practices from around the world are instructive, in the context, for example, Colombia, we have to remind ourselves that reconciliation is context-specific and should be defined by local realities. And Colombia should decide which needs are to be operationalized within the broader peace building and development architecture of the society. It is important that the design of reconciliation approaches adopted for each country should be locally grounded, and they should be owned by the people of that country. And I think as we also focus on reconciliation, we have to remember that reconciliation is not an end. It's not an end in itself. It is a means to an end. And so we have to design whatever we do in that context. So it would seem, therefore, that a broad-based approach to reconciliation is important and necessary to ensure that national and community mechanisms established to promote peace are strengthened. Now, I think one of the major casualties of any conflicts, I think we would all agree, is the rule of law. The weakening of the state authority, insecurity that prevails, the erosion of institutions of governance and civil society. So typically, conflict societies are characterized by lack of rule of law, past and present, violations of human rights, as we observed already. And also, we have to remember that all the time that an end to conflict does not automatically bring an end to violence. It doesn't bring an end to human rights violations. And it doesn't bring an end, or it doesn't bring immediate economic prosperity. And I think these goals must remain the focus of the process as we move forward. And I think we have to also remember that we have to be very cautious as we move forward in terms of the kind of process that we define, because the manner in which these processes are handled can play an important role in the consolidation of peace and the establishment of an atmosphere conducive to economic growth and development, and the emergence of a society that is built on the respect of human rights and human dignity. So I mentioned here that one of the major focuses that we try to, in my experience, we try to do is the question of promotion of rule of law. And I think the rule of law has been recognized as a central focus of domestic efforts to promote good governance. One of the key aims of the rule of law is to limit state power. thereby checking its arbitrary, oppressive, and despotic tendencies, and to ensure the equal treatment and protection of all citizens, irrespective of race, ethnicity, class, and status. And of course, in the scheme of things, a very important aspect of the project of the rule of law is the national constitution. I mean, in every country, a national constitution articulates the vision of the society. It defines the fundamental principles by which a country is to be organized. And of course, it's the document that distributes power within the country and plays an important role in national building and consolidating the national state. And I think in that context, the rule of law must aim to achieve specific objectives, which I think we can try to identify. It must, one, ensure regulation and limitation of the powers of government and the provision of mechanisms to ensure the efficiency of such limitations. Two, the provision of measures that ensure political accountability and of political leaders on the basis of openness, probity, and honesty. And three, that past human rights violations are punished and that there is no impunity. And four, that the human rights of the people are fully protected. Five, that the disputes, including those concerning the constitutionality of legislation and the government conduct, are adjudicated impartially by regular, ordinary courts that are independent of the protagonists. Further, it must, I think, that ordinary laws ensure that ordinary laws are applied in the execution of governance and adjudication of disputes are made in conformity with the provisions of the Constitution and in accordance with the procedure of lawmaking. And I think there should be clearly formulated and transparent processes by which political leaders and government officials are held accountable for their actions to the people. And all of these, I think, are important factors in the goal and as we frame the type of rule of law we are trying to advance. And we also need to ensure that public agencies are responsive to the needs of the public and promote socio-economic development for the benefit of all citizens in an equitable manner. And of course, we have to ensure that information which enables accountability to be promoted and be effective are promoted. That we provide the necessary information to ensure that, in fact, accountability can take place. Now, and I think a critical part of the project of the rule of law involves the question of judicial reform in post-conflict societies. And I think that judicial reform in most post-conflict society is particularly important because the effectiveness of constitutionalism and dealing with past human rights violations as elements of the rule of law depend on how the limitations imposed on the government by the Constitution are enforced by the courts. So the courts have a crucial role to play in this project. And we've seen that, of course, in the new reformed constitutions in post-conflict societies, the articulation of rights of the people is a major element of the developments that follow post-conflict constitution making. So clearly, as I've tried to point out, the role of the courts is critical. And that means that, of course, judicial reform has to take center stage, and the challenge there is how do you ensure that the courts are actually responsive to the challenges that are posed by conflict societies. And I think critical to the reform that we need to focus on in that kind of project is the independence of the judiciary. The judiciary has to be seen in fact and in reality as independent. And it is the only thing that can protect the independence of the judiciary is that, in fact, it's grounded in and is responsive to the needs of the people. And I think we see that judicial independence is something that is recognized in many international instruments. And of course, the main pillars of judicial independence are institutional and financial autonomy. We have to ensure that there is institutional and financial autonomy if we are to ensure that, in fact, the judiciary is independent. Additionally, many discussions on judicial independence tend to focus on the higher courts, the Constitutional Court, the High Courts, and all that. And I think with the discussion of the independence of the judiciary in the rule of law discourse, it's important to discuss those courts. I think that we have to go beyond that and look at the role of the lower courts. We must recognize that the lower courts require comparable protection. In many jurisdictions, the lower courts play a much, much more important role and are closer to the people than, in fact, the higher courts. So what we need, therefore, to do is to, as we look at judicial reform and strengthening the court systems, we need to also take into account the lower courts and ensure that the lower courts are well equipped, they also benefit from the independence of the judiciary, and that they are provided with sufficient resources to ensure that they play their role in society. Another crucial element, I think, with respect to judiciaries is the question of having a representative judiciary. Upholding the judicial oath of office to administer justice to all persons represents a considerable challenge for judges who are inevitably the product of their social conditioning, education, gender, and ethnicity. If they are to discharge fully their judicial oaths and to enjoy the broad confidence of the people, they must be drawn from a wide array of different backgrounds to ensure a better understanding of the experience of those with whom they'll be dealing with. The need to maintain a gender balance within the judiciary is now widely recognized and is an important factor that should be striven for. In addition to, I think, focusing on the judiciary, we find that there's another area of institutions that can be quite helpful in transitional societies, and that is the creation of oversight bodies that can play a major role in promoting human rights. And here what I'm suggesting is that judicial reform should include the establishment of oversight bodies and bodies that can deal with the issues relating to disciplinary procedures, for example, complaints that can be brought about the operations of judicial system. Now, in this context, I think what we're talking about is the various institutions that many countries have created at the level of, for example, the national human rights institutions, popularly known as human rights commissions. You find that in many countries this has become a major, they've become major oversight bodies relating to human rights. And in this context, there is, in fact, an international instrument that was developed in Paris, popularly known as the Paris Principles, which gives ideas in terms of how you can structure such bodies and how you can improve on the effectiveness of those bodies. In addition to the question of bodies like a Human Rights Commission, some countries have experimented with bodies like Ombudsman and the Gender Equality Commissions and many other types of oversight bodies. And these are supposed to complement the work of the judiciary. And the key thing is that often these institutions are much easier to access and much less expensive than the regular courts, and therefore can play a very critical role in the promotion and protection of human rights. Another issue that comes up with respect to post-conflict societies is the question of the oversight over security forces and the police. In conflict societies, the police are often poorly trained and badly equipped, and as a result end up being the major culprits in the violation of human rights. They are often perceived as corrupt and inefficient, and many citizens do not believe that the police and other security agents have the ability to adequately protect them from crime and other human rights violations. And I think here the question then, of course, is that comes up is the question of accountability within the forces. Typically, few citizens know that, in fact, the police and security forces are accountable to the law. And I think what is suggested here is that we look into measures to subject the police and the army to civilian oversight. There are strong policy and practical considerations that support the argument that oversight bodies should enjoy jurisdiction over members of the security forces to efficiently promote the rule of law. The Paris principles themselves that I referred to earlier on call for human rights commissions to have the power to investigate any instance of human rights violations which they decide to take up, including violations by security forces. In a post-conflict environment, subjecting the police and security forces to civilian oversight promotes the idea of accountability of the security forces to the citizens and reminds security forces that, unlike during conflict, in post-conflict society, the security forces have to operate within the law and under civilian control. So I think these are important considerations and ideas that I think many countries have promoted in the context of ensuring that you create conditions under which forces which during conflict were seen as above the law to be subjected to the law. And clearly, the importance of these oversight bodies relates to the simplicity in terms of access, and often also that they tend to be much faster than the regular courts in dealing with such issues, because of course they're not encumbered by many of the rules of evidence that often courts find themselves constrained by. Now, I would like then to move on and discuss the other options that I mentioned earlier on, because I think I mentioned the fact that often we focus on judicial reform, we focus on the promotion of rule of law, but clearly there's also the question of, which I raised at the beginning, how do you actually deal with the past human rights violations? Now, one approach, of course, is the amnesty approach. And here, of course, I would also like to discuss amnesty together with the question of truth commissions. Now, amnesty is, of course, a situation where the state decides that they are to forgive or rather pardon persons that were involved in human rights violation. Now, of course, by forgiving violators, the state aims to affirm its power over them as a supreme ruler over its subjects. However, amnesties, I think we all agree, have many challenges and difficulties. It's a common misconception that trading amnesty for peace is equivalent to absence of accountability. Now, as the South African case illustrates, amnesties can be tied to accountability mechanisms. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the fact that the South African Truth Commission had amnesty tied to accountability. That amnesty was only available where the party came forward and provided the truth as to what had happened, and of course apologized for what had happened. And also amnesties were restricted to political acts. So one avenue, of course, is the Truth Commission process. When you look at the South African process, I think that the lessons to be drawn from there is that if a Truth Commission is to succeed, one of the key elements is really leadership. That people have to believe in the process, but also I think that the leadership has to be leadership that is trusted. And I think many would argue that South Africa was lucky in many ways that they had a person of the stature of Desmond Tutu to lead the process, who was accepted by all sides as really being fair and open to the truth. Now, there's of course a very strong case for prosecutions. And prosecutions can either be, from the experience that we've had, can either be at the domestic level or, of course, at the international level. Now, it is said that prosecuting leaders responsible for violations of international human rights is necessary to discourage future human rights abuses and to deter vigilante justice and reinforce respect for law and the new democratic order. Now, while prosecutions might initially provoke resistance, many analysts believe that national reconciliation cannot take place as long as justice is foreclosed. Failure to prosecute leaders responsible for human rights abuses breeds contempt for the law and encourages future violations. So there was clearly a very strong argument for going the prosecution way. Now, of course, the difficulty often with the prosecutions is that very often in a post-conflict society, the persons that are responsible for the commission of many of the crimes remain in power or have some sort of influence. And of course, then you have the whole debate as to truth, peace versus justice, and which comes first. And of course, the experiences in the case of the international tribunals that were set up with respect to Yugoslavia and Rwanda illustrate that that prosecutions can, of course, be used to promote justice. There's also the case that, of course, prosecutions do help to restore the victim's dignity. Now, the other argument, of course, that's used with respect to prosecutions is that they do help in creating the record, that they do help to create an authoritative record of what actually happened, that it's a way of rendering the truth. So, as a result, I think what you see then in the context of the options, that yes, you have the option of prosecution, but it's not exclusionary. You can have prosecutions as well as truth and reconciliation. And both, I think, serve the purpose of first the deterrence aspect that we talked about and the punishment, but also the recording of the truth as to what happened. And I think in all these processes, whether you go the truth way or the prosecution way, the critical thing is that you need legitimacy. You need fairness. You need a credible process and transparent process. Because I think those are critical to, in fact, ensuring that the process is accepted by both sides. Some, of course, would argue that prosecutions can be too expensive and can take a long time, and that there's also always a problem between legal truth and the truth as ordinary people know it. Of course, the example of the tribunals, Yugoslavia and Rwanda, is given in terms of the cost that the UN and the international community spent on the proceedings in those projects. But I think that one has to emphasize the point that one cannot put a price on peace. And I think that as one embarks on reconstructing society, as one embarks on determining the truth, one has to realize that it is in fact an expensive project. There is also, I think, one or two things. If one were to opt the truth commission approach, one has to realize is that I think that the time factor is important, in the sense that successful truth commissions, like the South African process, and I think many agree that the South African process was not perfect, but that it did make a major contribution to the peace process in South Africa. And I think one of the major elements of it was that it was focused on a defined period. You don't want a process like this to be going on and on for a long time. And I think it's very, very important that that is determined, that how long the process is going to go on and what periods are going to be covered in terms of uncovering the truth. And of course, the focus on establishing the truth was also a critical factor of the process. And I think that one of the reasons, for example, in South Africa, they opted for the truth commissions rather than prosecutions was a clear understanding that if they had used the court process, first of all, the court process would have been tied up for years in terms of trying to resolve the various disputes. If you look at the Truth Commission in South Africa, there were 8,000 applications by persons who had committed violations. And that, if they had gone to the courts, would have taken years to resolve. And also, given the structure of the South African society, in the sense that at the time of the end of apartheid, you had a situation where the judiciary was something like 90% white, would in fact have been a situation where the decisions were being made by a white judiciary, which would have in fact made the racial conflict even worse. So I think that, and I think that drives us to the point that whatever process one adopts, one has to look at the context, that it has to be context-driven, that what is best for a particular country, and that goes to the history of the country, the history of the conflict, and what are the possibilities that in fact can be employed to promote peace in that country. The experience of prosecutions, of course, as I pointed out, they can be at the level of international, but it can also be domestic. But a drawback, I think, with the the domestic system is, of course, the fact that the courts will end up being tied up with these processes for a very long time. But also, there's the problem that I tried to point out, for example, in the context of South Africa, where actually I think the judiciary would have been a major casualty, in fact, if the court system had been used. Now, at the international level, we've seen two examples of international prosecution. That's the Rwanda Tribunal and the Yugoslav Tribunal. Now, one of the major criticisms of the international process is that it doesn't take place in the theater where the violations happen. So, for example, in the context of Rwanda, the tribunal was meeting in Arusha, which is very far from actually Rwanda, and there was no, it doesn't help in terms of the community actually knowing what's going on. And the same, I think, can be said with respect to Yugoslavia, in the sense that even there, you see that the hearings were in the Hague, and what happened was in the Balkans. And there is this problem that develops in terms of the disconnect between the process at the international level, if you opt for international process, and the local community. Apart from the fact that there are major issues with respect to witnesses, the costs in terms of transportation of people from the theater to actually a jurisdiction where that is being held. Now, of course, we also do have other tribunals that have been set up to deal with the specific crisis. For example, you have, in addition to the Yugoslav and Rwanda, you have the Cambodia Tribunal. That is very specific. Now, of course, one of the arguments for international tribunals is the fact that there's the perception that the local jurisdictions are not able to deal with the challenges that face that particular country. And of course, that is tied to the other argument that when you have international tribunals, they do not end up strengthening the local systems because they're not really connected between what's happening in the country. The local judiciaries do not benefit from the processes that go on internationally. So I think those are some of the things that one has to think about in terms of whether one opts for an international system or a domestic system. And I think what I would like to emphasize, so that we can have time for discussions and questions, is really that the decision as to how one goes forward should be one that is context-driven. It is crucial that whatever approach is taken, it is one that reflects the conditions in a given country. And I think that the options that are available, as we pointed out, can be prosecution, can be truth and reconciliation, but they are not exclusive. Many processes have combined both. And I would argue that the South African system, although it's known for the truth aspect, was in fact also a prosecution process. Because if you failed to get amnesty, then of course you are liable to prosecution. And if you didn't apply for amnesty, you're liable for prosecution. And in addition, there was also an element of reparations. The Truth Commission did receive complaints of people that had suffered as a result of the conflict and did provide reparations. Now, of course, in the context of reparations, the issue of damages always comes up, and I think that here, again, when you look at what, for example, Tutu said of the South African Commission, that rather than put a price on the damages that had been done, it was that to him that would be wrong, that there can be no price on the loss of life. And therefore the approach was more to look at how do you help the families that suffered as a result of the conflict. And that of course also means social programs, improving education, socio-economic conditions, and whatever that is needed to correct the consequences or the legacy of the conflict. In conclusion, I just want to emphasize that legal accountability for past human rights violations and improvements in the respect of human rights and the consolidation of the rule of law in post-conflict societies will depend on the strengthening of institutions that underpin democracy, that underpin good governance and the rule of law. Such institutions include the courts, the police, correctional services, and the oversight institutions. And as societies, I mean, there are many, many challenges, of course, as I pointed out, that face these various institutions. As societies face the challenges, they must realize that reconciliation takes a long time. And for the generation that lived through the conflict would never be total. And I think that we have to accept. What is important is to lay the foundations for reconciliation. Further, it has to be realized that efforts aimed at promoting reconciliation cannot succeed unless the economic conditions in past conflict countries improve and develop to a level where the countries are able to have the capacity to sustain the institutions necessary for the prosecution of past human rights violations, entrenchment of good governance, and the protection of human rights and the rule of law. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hi, Professor. Thanks to being here. I just think that you touched all the complexity of our conflict, and you mentioned amnesty, truth commissions, accountability, access to justice, and so on. I would like to ask you, Nen, my understanding is that a transitional justice is also when a society moves from a scenario with massive human rights violations to a scenario where people are able to exercise their own rights. So my question is it possible to have effective justice in a context where we have several perpetrators, such as the guerrilla, the paramilitary, and the state, and plus we have several social problems, such as exclusion, poverty, just to mention a few. So how is it possible to have justice in a context? And finally, to what extent, if we have any kind of amnesty, is it possible to make sure that those perpetrators won't commit the same crimes again?
Thank you very much for those very, very important points. That I think that you are very right, that clearly, as one promotes human rights, one of the critical issues is, of course, access to justice. I mean, this has to be promoted. And I think this is why I was saying that rather than focus on courts alone, that we also have to develop other institutions that can promote oversight, are much more accessible and are not too legalistic, because of course lawyers cost money and all kinds of things. So what you try to do is to put in place additional institutions. And here one can look at the various examples of, as we said, for example, the question of, human rights commissions. In some countries, they've instituted gender commissions and all kinds of institutions which are geared to support and complement the role of the courts. But even in the context of the courts, I think that our focus tends to be on the high courts, on the Constitutional Court, what it's doing, and the high courts, and we ignore the lower courts that are crucial to, in fact, the delivery of justice, because the average person, that's where they go. And I think that we need to also emphasize access there and professionalism and competence in those courts so that, in fact, justice is meaningful to the people. Now, in the context of the debate over amnesty and the prosecution is, of course, a major issue which is very difficult to resolve because what countries find confronted with is often that the people that perpetrated the atrocities are often still in power. You know, that they still have some power to exercise. And then the question becomes, how do we actually go forward? And here, I would give you a personal experience. I mean, in terms of, because South Africa, because I worked there, the challenge in South Africa in '94 was that, yes, you have democratic elections, and the ANC comes to power. But the military in South Africa that was in power, one of the strongest militaries on the African continent, I mean, something like 600,000 soldiers, well-trained. In the context of South Africa, even worse, because that force was exclusively white. And then you have a government that comes into power, you know, after a struggle, and has to deal with it. Do they, on day one, announce that they're going to arrest the soldiers? And of course, that's probably not a realistic option, isn't it? So of course, they had to weigh in terms of what can they do in the context, and that's why I think I was emphasizing the context. In the context of prosecutions, that yes, they could prosecute, but the South African judiciary was 90% white at the time. And most of the victims, if not all, were black. So you'd have really, and that's where context is important. So you see there that the situation there is not exactly like in Colombia, you know, in the sense of the structure of the society. And therefore, the issue that, of course, came up is that, yes, we have to pursue the perpetrators. And I think it's important to do that because, of course, we send a message. But not only that, the dignity of the people that suffered, but also to ensure that no further, that we do not tolerate impunity of the commission of human violations. So, of course, you had to balance that with the conditions, and that's why I think in the end they come up with a process which involves prosecution and also truth. And part of the reason why they took on the truth approach is that the actual truth in terms of what happened to the victims was actually often exclusively in the knowledge of the military. Families were looking for people, you know, all over. They didn't know what happened. And it was amazing that, in fact, after the process, many, you know, secret graves and all that which were known only to the military were brought to the surface. Now, the question, of course, is that how do you punish those people who did that? And some argue that the punishment was the fact that they had to come up publicly and say they did this and explain and help to uncover the truth. And the expectation was, of course, that truth would bring closure to the families. And then, of course, the question of damages, that it was found, for example, that many of the perpetrators were, of course, military people. And in terms of damages, of course, it would be the state that would be paying the damages for what happened. And one of the arguments that was made was that it would be like the people compensating themselves. So in a way, they rather direct that money to the point that you raised, which is very important, the socio-economic conditions. The reason why violence erupted is because of the conditions, isn't it? And unless you address those conditions, the likelihood of recurrence is very high. So part of the, of course, of resolving and promoting reconciliation is, in fact, addressing the social economic conditions that bred the violence, that played midwife to the crisis. And also, let's not forget that one of the things that happens also is that, of course, we can't equate the violence of the state and the violence of the private actors the same. But both sides do engage in violations. And the problem is that each side has a version of the truth. And the question is, what is going to help move the process forward? And I think this is where I was quoting Albie Sachs at the beginning here, saying that it's very difficult to reconcile with the people who have killed your family and that kind of thing. But the expectation is that this is going to take a long time. But at least you can build the foundation for where this is not going to happen again, or at least makes it less likely that it will happen.
Thank you for your presentation, and I'm going to ask this question as a concerned citizen and also as a victim of conflict. And one of the major issues of the peace conversations in La Habana right now is participation in politics. Our Constitution grants the right to every citizen to vote and to be elected whenever he has not been condemned by human rights or civil rights violations. And this is why they have been talking about the possibility of a new constitution for these purposes. My question is, in the context of transitional justice system to reestablish civil and human rights and the rule of law, how should we redistribute power in Colombian society to increase the possibilities of a stable and durable peace?
The first point you brought out is, again, very important in terms of the participation of people who committed violations in politics. Now, again, here we have different approaches in the world. And I'm sure you're familiar with Eastern Europe, the process that was called lustration. So in Eastern Europe, the way they dealt with that issue was to say that if you were involved in violations, you are not eligible to participate in politics anymore. So that's an option that they took. And in fact, I think in some countries, they even said that you're not eligible to hold public office, basically. Now, of course, again, it's a question of context-driven in the sense that some would argue that you want to, is that a proper approach when you want to create, do you want to create an army of people that actually cannot work, cannot do anything, and does that create an incentive for them to actually continue being outlaws, that how do you deal with that in terms of, but one approach has been this lustration, and that's something that has happened a lot in Eastern Europe, in East Germany and all that sort of thing. Now, I think the crucial issue moving forward is that, conflicts undermine a society in many ways, including governance itself. And I think the critical point is really moving forward. How do you establish institutions that will have the legitimacy to govern, and that will also ensure that, in fact, you promote the rule of law? And here, I think that many institutions have a critical role to play. Of course, we begin with the Constitution itself. The Constitution articulates the vision of a society, isn't it? Justice Muhammad in South Africa used to say, a good national constitution is a constitution which, when you look into it, it's like an autobiography. You can see yourself, say, yeah, it's talking to me. So everyone should feel that way, that this document is talking to me. Now, how do you achieve that? Of course, it's a big challenge, isn't it? But if we can, it will be a good beginning. Now, of course, beyond that, we then, of course, need to establish institutions that ensure that, in fact, what we agreed on as the contract to govern our system is enforced, isn't it? And this is where, of course, now we come into the question of how do you promote the rule of law? How do you promote judiciary, which is critical to ensuring that it's an arbiter, in disputes. And it is seen as actually fair. And of course, that way promotes reconciliation. But I think critical too is that reconciliation must not be seen as an end. Because in the end, what will really underpin democracy and, in fact, reconciliation is dealing with the legacies, isn't it? Dealing with the underdevelopment, dealing with the economic challenges that actually played midwife to the conflict. Until you do that, you really have not resolved. And I would say that even in the context of, say, a country like South Africa, with all that it has done, many people praise its constitution and all that, the test is going to be its ability to bring equal participation in the economy, isn't it, to all the people, because there's a legacy that led to the conflict, and of course that has to be dealt with, and I think that's the way to ensure it. But I think the two go together, because you can't have economic development with poor governance. I mean, the policies that bring about development are articulated through good governance, isn't it, which embrace consultation, participation, and all those ensure that good policies are then adopted, and of course it ensures that there's development.
My question is about reintegration of former combatants. After a very long conflict, as the Colombian conflict, the combatants have so many skills oriented to war, but when they have to come back to civilian life, they don't have education, they are not prepared to do anything different. Then the labor reintegration is very complicated for the government. And here the government has opted for entrepreneurship, but it hasn't been that successful as expected. What would you suggest about labor reintegration of former combatants?
Yeah, thank you very much for that really very, very important point. Because of course, when conflict has been going on for a long time, in every conflict situation, you have the combatants that in a way it become their way of life. I mean that they have been living that life for a very long time. And you are removing that. And of course, we have to create an incentive that in fact they can lead another life, a better life than fighting. And the challenge is, of course, what you do. Now, if you look at most post-conflict societies, I mean, the UN, UNDP, they've been very involved in what they call, trying to address this issue. And I think one of the points that you brought out is something that they do, entrepreneurship, training, skills, and all that. But I think that what's often forgotten is that, you can see this in a lot of situations where, you examine these programs, and that is that you train skills, but don't forget to also jumpstart the economy, because these skills are only going to be useful if, in fact, they can be used. So, for example, in Liberia, I looked at a program where they were training taxi drivers, but there were no taxis to drive. But so in a way, you have to come around to this aspect that whatever you adopt in terms of how you address the ex-combatants, you also have to create real opportunities in the economy, so that in fact the skills that you are training them, they can use them. One of the other challenges that comes up in dealing with the combatants, which I think you have to address too, is the fact that sometimes the ordinary people who didn't take part in the conflict feel that the combatants are now privileged. Yeah, they are rewarded for having been in conflict rather than for having avoided fighting, in the sense that the entrepreneurship is targeted at these groups And how do you resolve that? And I think that we have to come up with an all-inclusive approach so that we don't create a new sort of conflict between the other people, ordinary people who didn't take part, are not classified as combatants, and therefore do not qualify for all these projects that are coming up. So my 2 points would be that we have to think about how to bring skills, different skills from the fighting skills that they had, but also relate that and make sure that we don't ignore the fact that it's related to the economy, that you have to, in some places where economies collapse, you have to jumpstart the economy. Otherwise, you are training entrepreneurs where there's actually no opportunity. And then, of course, the third point is the point I was making, that somehow avoid programs where it's very exclusive, that you are dealing with people only who are combatants, because it does cause a rift between the youth who didn't go to fight, who feel excluded from the processes.
Regarding prosecution, and considering that one of your major points during the talk is that any kind of process should be context-driven, how do you deal with the disparity between the domestic approach and the international approach? Mm-hmm. And is there any set of sort of crimes that are more susceptible to deal in the international courts? Mm-hmm. Or what is the experience in other contexts and conflicts?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much for, again, a very good question. I think at the international level, of course, as I said, the prosecutions can be at domestic or international level. Now, the international processes are often limited to really international crimes. So that's a limitation in the sense that if you look at the Yugoslav Tribunal, you look at the Rwanda Tribunal, all the ICC, and all that, the jurisdiction is only really international crimes, which is genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, torture, and all that. Now, of course, you can deal, at domestic level, you can deal with those plus other issues. Now, the advantage also at the international level is that, of course, there is no limitation in terms of statute of limitations. The international courts don't feel bound by, you can be prosecuted as long as you're alive, basically. Now, the downside, of course, is that it's a very expensive process. It takes prosecutions out of the theater where actually the conflict happened. So in the case of Colombia, if you look at even Rwanda, it's like happening in Tanzania, but what happened in Rwanda, so it doesn't happen there. So the advantage, of course, at the international level is that the international courts are able to act very independently because they're not afraid of the domestic power structures. So that's a big advantage. But the drawback is that many of them focus only really on what they call the big leaders, and not the ordinary people. Whereas in the domestic level, you can deal with both. Now, the challenge at the domestic level is, of course, that are you going to, first, do you have a good system that is able to actually do that? That it means to have a judicial system that's capable of handling those cases. And often, the judiciary is a casualty in the conflict too, isn't it? In that it also becomes a useless kind of system in a conflict situation. So that's one of the major challenges that I think one faces with respect to domestic, and the fear that some people would be too influential or too big to be prosecuted. So in the context of Yugoslavia, one could not envisage a Yugoslav court prosecuting Milosevic, in his country. And the only option becomes one of external, because then it's easier to do that. Yeah, I think that's how I would look at it. And again, I think one can have a combination. And we have an example of a combination. In terms of the Liberian conflict, Taylor, the leader, they decided to try him with an international tribunal. But they decided to try the lesser guys domestically. So I think you can have a combination as well.
Yes. Knowing that punishment is a true fact, what's a good manner to explain reconciliation to a kid?
Mm-hmm. And how do we explain reconciliation?
To a kid.
To a kid? Mm-hmm. Oh, okay, yeah. No, I think that the way I would explain it is to say that we can have both. In the sense that reconciliation does not exclude punishment. You can, as for example, I was trying to point out in the context of, say, the Truth Commission in South Africa, you have prosecutions as well as reconciliation. Now, I think the reason why societies opt for reconciliation and make it part of the whole thing is that in the end, the question becomes one of how do we live, together again, the parties that have been fighting. Because yes, you can punish, but you still have to deal with the question of how do we live together after that. And I think that we should not ignore, the fact that reconciliation is very hard. There's no doubt about that. I mean, can you imagine in some conflicts, for example, if you look at the Palestinian conflict and all that, reconciliation would be very hard to achieve because of the length and the breadth and all kinds of things that have happened. But at the same time, one, I think, has to realize that you have to have, as you punish, you have to focus also the future in terms of how is this society going to live together. And that's why I think you never really, both sides will never accept the same truth. It's very difficult. But I think you will come to an agreement where there is some common understanding that, okay, these things did happen, and let's move forward. And I think that's the way I would explain it. But it's not exclusive, that you can have both. But it's dictated by conditions that very often you have to have, because you're thinking about dealing with impunity, dealing with the perpetrators, but you're also thinking about the future. How do we live together after this occurrence? Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.